The sound of splintering wood echoed through the abandoned warehouse as Jake's boot came down on the vintage acoustic guitar, the rosewood body cracking like thunder as 20 years of careful craftsmanship shattered into pieces. Ethan Cross watched in frozen horror as his grandfather's, Martin D. 28, the only thing he had left of the man who raised him, split apart under the weight of 3 laughing bullies who had no idea they'd just destroyed the most precious possession of a former Navy SEAL who specialized in acoustic warfare. The same fingers that had once calibrated sonic weapons, capable of disabling enemy submarines, now trembled as they reached for the broken fragments. And Jake Morrison was about to learn that some mistakes can't be taken back. Ethan Cross had perfected the art of invisibility long before he ever set foot in Riverside High School. At 18, he possessed the kind of quiet presence that came from years of military training. But to his new classmates, he simply appeared to be another awkward transfer student trying to blend into the background. His sandy brown hair fell across his forehead in a deliberately messy style that helped him avoid eye contact, and his flannel shirts and worn jeans gave him the appearance of someone who shopped at thrift stores rather than someone who had served 3 tours of duty in classified naval operations before his medical discharge. The guitar case slung across his shoulder was his most noticeable feature, a battered leather case that had traveled with him through 6 different foster homes and 3 military bases. Inside was his grandfather's 1954 Martin D. 28, an instrument that had somehow survived both the old man's death and Ethan's chaotic journey through the foster care system. The guitar was more than just an instrument to him. It was his connection to the only person who had ever truly understood him, the retired Navy acoustics engineer who had taught him that sound could be both a weapon and a healing force. What none of his classmates at Riverside High could have known was that Ethan Cross had spent the last 4 years as part of the Navy's most classified acoustic warfare program. He had been trained to use sound as a weapon, to manipulate frequencies that could disable electronic systems, disorient enemies, and even cause structural damage to buildings. His ears had been trained to detect the smallest variations in acoustic signatures, his mind capable of calculating the exact frequency needed to shatter glass or disrupt sonar systems. He could identify the make and model of a submarine engine from half a mile away just by listening to its acoustic signature through hydrophones. The medical discharge had come after a training accident involving a prototype sonic weapon that had left him with partial hearing loss in his left ear and chronic tinnitus that sounded like a constant high-pitched whine. The Navy doctors had declared him unfit for active duty, and at 17, Ethan had found himself back in the foster care system with nothing but his grandfather's guitar and a head full of classified knowledge that he could never share with anyone. Riverside High School was supposed to be a fresh start, his last placement before aging out of the system entirely. The small town of Cedar Falls, Oregon, seemed like the kind of place where he could finish his senior year without drawing attention to himself. He had learned long ago that being noticed usually meant being targeted, and he was tired of fighting battles that never seemed to end. The hallways of Riverside High were typical of any small-town school: linoleum floors that squeaked under, sneakers, lockers that slammed shut with metallic clangs, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights that made Ethan's tinnitus worse. He had been assigned a locker in the senior hallway, and he spent his first morning trying to memorize his schedule while keeping his head down and his mouth shut. The guitar case drew attention immediately. Other students would glance at it as they passed, some with curiosity, others with the kind of dismissive look that suggested they thought he was trying too hard to be interesting. Ethan had considered leaving it at his foster home, but the thought of being separated from his grandfather's guitar for 8 hours a day felt like losing the last connection to his old life. He was organizing his textbooks when he heard the voice behind him, loud, confident, and dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that Ethan had learned to recognize in dozens of different schools and military bases. Well, what do we have here? The voice belonged to a stocky kid with bleached blonde hair and arms that suggested he spent more time in the weight room than the library. Looks like we got ourselves a little musician. Ethan turned slowly, his military training automatically cataloging the positions of the three boys who had formed a semicircle around his locker. The leader was clearly the blonde kid, probably around 6 feet tall, with the kind of swagger that came from being the biggest fish in a small pond. The other two were followers, one tall and lanky with nervous energy, the other shorter but built like a linebacker. "I'm Jake Morrison," the leader announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed. "These are my friends Tyler and Marcus. We like to personally welcome all the new students to Riverside High." Ethan recognized the tone immediately. It was the same fake friendliness that predators used to lure their prey into a false sense of security. He had heard it from drill sergeants who were about to make his life hell, from foster parents who were about to ship him off to another home, from commanding officers who were about to assign him to the most dangerous missions. "I'm Ethan," he replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Years of acoustic training had taught him to modulate his voice precisely, and he kept it deliberately soft and non-threatening. "I'm not looking for any trouble." "Trouble?" Jake laughed, the sound echoing off the metal lockers. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just being friendly. Isn't that right, boys?" Tyler, the tall one, nodded eagerly, super friendly. "We just want to make sure you understand how things work around here." Marcus, the shorter one, was staring at the guitar case with undisguised interest. "So you play guitar, huh? What kind of music? Let me guess. Emo? Goth? Some kind of sad boy? Acoustic stuff?" Ethan felt his shoulders tense slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. "Just classical mostly. Some folk songs my grandfather taught me." "Grandfather's songs?" Jake's grin widened. "That's adorable. I bet you're one of those sensitive artist types, right? Probably write poetry about your feelings and stuff." The first bell rang, giving Ethan an excuse to escape. "I should get to class," he said, shouldering his backpack and picking up the guitar case. "Class can wait," Jake said, stepping closer. "We're having a conversation here. See, the thing about Riverside High is that we have certain ... traditions. And one of those traditions is that new students need to understand the social hierarchy." Ethan could feel his pulse quickening, but not from fear. His body was responding the way it had been trained to respond to potential threats. Heightened awareness, calculated assessment of angles and distances, automatic cataloging of potential weapons in the environment. But instead of acting on those instincts, he forced himself to remain still and submissive. "I understand," he said quietly. "I just want to go to class and graduate. I'm not looking to cause any problems for anyone." "Good attitude," Jake said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "I think we're going to get along just fine. Just remember, this is our school, and you're just visiting. Act accordingly." As the three boys walked away, Ethan allowed himself a moment to assess what had just happened. He had been in this situation dozens of times before, in different schools and different contexts, but the dynamic was always the same. There was always a Jake Morrison, always a group of followers, always the same predictable power play designed to establish dominance over the new kid. What Jake Morrison didn't know was that Ethan Cross had faced down Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, had stared into the eyes of enemy combatants who would have killed him without hesitation, had been trained by some of the most elite soldiers in the world to handle situations far more dangerous than a high school bully with an attitude problem. Jake Morrison also didn't know about the promise Ethan had made to his grandfather on his deathbed, that he would use his training and his knowledge only to protect others, never to harm someone who didn't truly deserve it. The old man had seen too much violence in his own naval career, had helped design weapons that could level buildings and kill hundreds of people. And he had made Ethan swear that he would be better than the men who had trained him. As Ethan walked to his first class, the guitar case bumping gently against his leg, he tried to convince himself that he could make it through the next 6 months without breaking that promise. He had survived worse than Jake Morrison and his crew. He could survive this too. But deep down, in the part of his mind that had been shaped by years of military training and combat experience, he knew that Jake Morrison was going to push and push until something broke. And when that happened, Ethan wasn't sure he would be able to keep his grandfather's promise. The tinnitus in his left ear seemed to grow louder as he walked down the hallway, a constant reminder of the accident that had ended his military career and the weapons he had been trained to use. Sound was his specialty, frequencies and vibrations and the precise calculation of acoustic force. He had learned to weaponize something as simple as a whistle, to turn music into a tool of war. Jake Morrison had no idea what he was dealing with, but Ethan Cross was beginning to suspect that he was about to find out. Jake Morrison ruled Riverside High School with the kind of absolute authority that came from 4 years of carefully cultivated intimidation and a social network that extended deep into the town's power structure. His father owned Morrison Construction, the largest employer in Cedar Falls, and his mother sat on the school board, giving Jake a level of protection that made him virtually untouchable. Teachers looked the other way when he bent the rules. Administrators found excuses to avoid disciplining him, and students had learned that crossing Jake Morrison was a mistake they would regret for the rest of their high school careers. The senior hallway was Jake's kingdom, a stretch of lockers and classrooms where his word was law and his presence commanded instant respect. He had claimed the prime real estate near the main entrance, where he could see everyone who entered and exited the building. His locker was decorated with football trophies and college recruitment letters, a shrine to his status as the school's star linebacker and the town's golden boy. But football was just one aspect of his dominance. Jake had built his reputation on being the kind of person who could make or break your social standing with a single word. Tyler Rodriguez had been Jake's lieutenant for 3 years, ever since Jake had rescued him from a group of seniors who had been planning to stuff him in a locker during his freshman year. Tyler was tall and gangly, with the kind of nervous energy that came from constantly trying to prove himself worthy of Jake's friendship. He had learned to anticipate Jake's moods, to laugh at his jokes before the punchline, to echo his opinions with the enthusiasm of a true believer. Tyler's loyalty was absolute, but it was also born from fear. He had seen what happened to people who disappointed Jake Morrison, and he had no intention of becoming another casualty. Marcus Chien was the newest addition to Jake's inner circle, a transfer student from California who had earned his place through sheer brutality. Marcus was shorter than the other two but built like a tank, with muscles that spoke of hours spent in underground fight clubs and back alley boxing matches. He had arrived at Riverside High with a reputation for violence that preceded him, stories of broken bones and hospital visits that had made even Jake take notice. Marcus didn't talk much, but when he did speak, people listened, because they knew that his words usually preceded his fists. The three of them had developed a system over the years, a carefully orchestrated approach to maintaining their position at the top of the school's social hierarchy. Jake was the strategist, the one who identified targets and planned campaigns of psychological warfare. Tyler was the scout, the one who gathered information and spread rumors with surgical precision. Marcus was the enforcer, the one who stepped in when words weren't enough and physical intimidation became necessary. Their domain extended far beyond the senior hallway. They controlled the best table in the cafeteria, the prime parking spots in the student lot, and the most coveted spots on the bleachers during football games. They had their fingers in every social circle, their influence touching every aspect of school life. Teachers knew not to assign them seats next to students they didn't like. Administrators knew not to schedule them for detention at the same time as their enemies, and other students knew not to cross them unless they wanted to become the next target. The system worked because it was built on fear, but it was also built on loyalty. Jake had a gift for identifying the outcasts and the vulnerable, the students who needed protection or acceptance more than they needed dignity. He would offer them a place in his orbit, a chance to be associated with power and status, in exchange for their absolute obedience. Some accepted the deal willingly, grateful for any chance to escape the bottom of the social ladder. Others resisted, until the pressure became too much to bear, until the alternative to submission was complete social annihilation. Jake's methods were sophisticated, refined through years of practice and observation. He rarely resorted to outright violence, preferring instead to use psychological pressure and social manipulation to achieve his goals. He would identify a target's weaknesses, their insecurities, their fears, their desperate need for acceptance, and then exploit those vulnerabilities with surgical precision. A rumor here, a public humiliation there, a carefully timed exclusion from a social event, and even the strongest students would eventually break under the constant pressure. The teachers and administrators at Riverside High had learned to look the other way when Jake's campaigns began. They told themselves that it was just normal teenage drama, that kids needed to learn to handle these situations on their own, that intervening would only make things worse. But the truth was that Jake's family connections made him untouchable, and everyone knew it. His father's construction company had built half the buildings in town. His mother's position on the school board gave her influence over hiring and firing decisions, and his uncle was the sheriff. Going against Jake Morrison meant going against the Morrison family, and in a town the size of Cedar Falls, that was professional suicide. The few students who had tried to stand up to Jake over the years had learned hard lessons about the price of defiance. There was Sarah Martinez, who had tried to organize a petition against bullying during her junior year and had found herself the target of a whisper campaign that branded her as a troublemaker and a liar. There was David Kim, who had recorded Jake pushing a freshman into a locker and had watched the video mysteriously disappear from his phone after a visit from Marcus Chen. There was Lisa Thompson, who had tried to report Jake's behavior to the administration and had found herself suspended for making false accusations. After Jake's mother had a private conversation with the principal, the message was clear: resistance was futile, and anyone who tried to challenge Jake's authority would be crushed without mercy. Students learned to keep their heads down, to avoid eye contact, to laugh at his jokes and pretend to enjoy his company. They learned that survival meant submission, and that the only way to make it through high school was to accept their place in the hierarchy that Jake had created. But Jake Morrison was always looking for new challenges, new targets to test his skills against. He had grown bored with the usual suspects, the obvious victims who crumbled at the first sign of pressure. He was looking for someone who would provide more entertainment, someone who would fight back just enough to make the eventual victory more satisfying. When he saw Ethan Cross walking through the hallways with his guitar case and his quiet demeanor, he knew he had found his next project. The guitar case was particularly intriguing. It suggested that Ethan was one of those artistic types, the sensitive souls who thought they were too good for the rest of the world. Jake had dealt with musicians before. They were usually easy targets, more concerned with their image than their safety, more likely to back down than fight back. But there was something about Ethan that was different, something in his posture and his movements that suggested he wasn't quite what he appeared to be. Jake had made a career out of reading people, of identifying their weaknesses and exploiting them for his own entertainment. He could usually tell within minutes of meeting someone exactly how they would react to pressure, exactly what buttons to push to get the response he wanted. But Ethan Cross was harder to read than most, his quiet demeanor masking something that Jake couldn't quite identify. That made him even more interesting as a target. Jake Morrison loved a challenge, and Ethan Cross was clearly going to provide one. The question was whether the new kid would break quickly or slowly, whether he would crumble under the first wave of pressure, or hold out long enough to make the game interesting. Either way, Jake was looking forward to finding out. The first real encounter came 3 days later during lunch period, when Ethan was sitting alone at a corner table in the cafeteria, his guitar case leaning against the wall beside him. He had been picking at a sandwich while reviewing notes for his afternoon physics class, trying to ignore the constant background noise of 400 teenagers eating and socializing in the confined space. The acoustic chaos of the cafeteria was particularly difficult for him to handle. His trained ears picked up every conversation, every clatter of silverware, every scrape of chairs against linoleum, creating a symphony of sound that made his tinnitus flare up like a warning signal. He had chosen this table specifically because it was isolated from the main flow of traffic, tucked away in a corner where he could eat in peace without drawing unwanted attention. The strategy had worked. For the first few days of school, allowing him to observe the social dynamics of Riverside High without becoming part of them. He had identified the various cliques and territories, mapped out the invisible boundaries that governed teenage social warfare, and located the safe zones where he could exist without interference. But Jake Morrison had been watching him too, studying his habits and routines with the patience of a predator stalking its prey. Jake had noticed that Ethan always sat alone, always chose the same isolated table, always kept his guitar case within arm's reach like a security blanket. These observations had given Jake valuable intelligence about his target's psychology. Ethan was clearly someone who valued solitude, who preferred to avoid confrontation, who had built his entire existence around the principle of remaining invisible. "Mind if we sit down?" Jake's voice cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade, friendly on the surface but carrying an undertone of menace that made Ethan's shoulders tense immediately. He looked up to find Jake, Tyler, and Marcus standing beside his table, their lunch trays in hand and expressions that suggested this wasn't really a request. Ethan's military training kicked in automatically, his mind cataloging the positions of the 3 boys, the exits from the cafeteria, the potential weapons within reach. But he forced himself to remain calm, to project the same quiet vulnerability that had served as his camouflage for the past few days. "It's a free country," he said quietly, gesturing to the empty chairs around the table. Jake smiled as he settled into the chair directly across from Ethan, while Tyler and Marcus flanked him on either side. The positioning was deliberate, designed to make Ethan feel surrounded and trapped, with no easy escape route. "You know, I've been thinking about you," Jake said, unwrapping his sandwich with deliberate slowness. "Trying to figure out what your story is." "I don't have a story," Ethan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to get through senior year." "Everyone has a story," Tyler chimed in, his voice carrying the eager tone of someone trying to impress their leader. "The question is whether you're going to tell it willingly or whether we're going to have to dig it out of you." Marcus remained silent, but his presence was intimidating enough without words. He sat with his arms crossed, his muscles clearly defined under his tight t-shirt, his dark eyes fixed on Ethan with the kind of predatory stare that suggested he was measuring him for violence. Ethan could see the signs of someone who had been in real fights: the slightly flattened nose, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the calloused knuckles that spoke of hours spent hitting heavy bags in human faces. "So what's with the guitar?" Jake asked, nodding toward the case. "You in a band or something? Planning to be the next big rock star?" Ethan felt his grip tighten on his sandwich, but he kept his expression neutral. "I just play for myself mostly, nothing fancy." "Come on, don't be modest," Jake pressed, his tone becoming more aggressive. "I bet you're one of those guys who thinks he's going to make it big, right?" Probably got a YouTube channel or something. Posting videos of yourself singing sad songs about how nobody understands you. The accuracy of the guess was unsettling. Ethan did have a small YouTube channel where he posted acoustic covers of his grandfather's favorite songs, but it only had a few dozen subscribers and was more of a memorial than a career move. The fact that Jake had somehow intuited this made Ethan realized that he was dealing with someone who was more observant and calculating than he had initially assumed. "I'm not trying to make it big," Ethan said carefully. "I just play because it reminds me of my grandfather. He taught me when I was younger." "Ah, that's sweet," Tyler said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Grandpa's little musician. I bet he's real proud of you, wherever he is." "He's dead," Ethan said flatly, the words coming out harder than he had intended. He saw Jake's eyes light up with interest, recognizing that he had struck a nerve. "Sorry for your loss," Jake said, but his tone suggested he was anything but sorry. "So you're an orphan then? That explains a lot. Let me guess. Foster care, right? Bounced around from home to home, never really belonged anywhere?" Ethan felt his jaw clench despite his efforts to remain calm. Jake's psychological profiling was uncomfortably accurate, hitting emotional targets with surgical precision. "Something like that," he admitted. "That's rough, man," Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly soft. "I've been there. Foster care sucks. Makes you feel like you're never really part of anything, like you're always just passing through." For a moment, Ethan felt a flicker of hope that maybe Marcus understood, that maybe this conversation would take a different direction. But then he saw the look that passed between Marcus and Jake, and he realized that the empathy was just another tactic, another way to gather information that could be used against him later. "The thing is," Jake continued, leaning forward across the table, "foster kids usually learn to be tough. They learn to fight for what they want, to stand up for themselves. But you double quotes." He paused, studying Ethan's face. "You don't seem like the fighting type. You seem like the type who just takes whatever life throws at you and asks for more." Ethan could feel the conversation heading toward dangerous territory, but he wasn't sure how to deflect it without revealing more about himself than he wanted to. "I don't like violence," he said simply. "I think there are better ways to solve problems." "Better ways," Tyler repeated, laughing. "Like what? Writing sad songs about your feelings? Playing your guitar until the bad people go away?" "Music can be powerful," Ethan said, and immediately regretted it. The words sounded pretentious, even to his own ears, and he could see Jake filing away the information for future use. "Powerful," Jake mused. "That's interesting. So you think your little guitar is going to protect you? You think if someone comes at you, you can just strum a few chords and they'll leave you alone?" Ethan realized that he was being backed into a corner, that every word he spoke was being twisted and used against him. This was psychological warfare at its finest, and Jake Morrison was clearly a master of the craft. "I just think there are better ways to handle conflict than violence," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Maybe," Jake said, his smile becoming more predatory. "But sometimes violence is the only language people understand. Sometimes you have to hurt someone to get their attention, to make them respect you." The threat was clear, even though it was wrapped in philosophical language. Jake was letting Ethan know that violence was coming, that the psychological pressure was just the beginning. And Ethan found himself in the impossible position of having to choose between breaking his promise to his grandfather and allowing himself to become another victim of Jake Morrison's campaign of intimidation. As the lunch period ended and the three boys left his table, Ethan sat in the empty cafeteria for a few more minutes, trying to process what had just happened. He had been evaluated, cataloged, and marked for destruction by someone who clearly understood the art of psychological warfare. The question now was whether he could survive the coming assault without compromising the principles that his Grandfather had died trying to instill in him. The guitar case beside him seemed heavier somehow, weighted down with the knowledge that it represented the only connection he had left to the man who had raised him. And Jake Morrison had already identified it as a target. What Jake Morrison and his crew didn't know was that Ethan Cross had been forged in the crucible of the United States Navy's most classified acoustic warfare program, a shadow operation that existed in the gray areas between conventional military doctrine and cutting-edge scientific research. At 14, while other kids his age were worried about algebra tests and school dances, Ethan had been recruited into a program that would transform him into something unprecedented, a human weapon capable of manipulating sound itself as a tool of war. The recruitment had happened by accident during a routine visit to the naval base where his grandfather worked as a senior acoustic engineer. Ethan had been waiting in the old man's office when a demonstration of prototype sonic weapons had gone wrong in the adjacent laboratory. A feedback loop had created a frequency that shattered every piece of glass in the building and sent trained technicians running for cover with their hands pressed to their ears. But Ethan had remained calm, his naturally acute hearing allowing him to identify the exact frequency causing the problem and suggest a solution that none of the engineers had considered. Admiral Sarah Reynolds, the project director, had been so impressed by the teenager's intuitive understanding of acoustic principles that she had convinced his grandfather to allow Ethan to join the program. What started as weekend tutorials in basic sound theory had evolved into a full-time military education that took place in underground facilities scattered across the country. By the time he turned 16, Ethan had learned to weaponize everything from dog whistles to industrial speakers, to calculate the exact frequency needed to disrupt human equilibrium or shatter reinforced concrete. The training had been unlike anything in conventional military education. Where other soldiers learned to use rifles and explosives, Ethan learned to use frequency generators and acoustic amplifiers. Where others practiced marksmanship and hand-to-hand combat, Ethan practiced calculating resonant frequencies and mapping acoustic environments. He learned that sound waves could be focused like laser beams, that certain frequencies could cause disorientation and nausea, that the human ear was both incredibly sensitive and remarkably vulnerable to the right kind of acoustic assault. His specialty had been underwater operations, where sound was the primary method of detection and communication. Ethan had learned to use sonar systems that could map enemy submarine positions from miles away, to deploy acoustic mines that could distinguish between friendly and hostile vessels, to operate weapons that could disable enemy sonar without causing permanent damage to the crew. He had become expert at reading the acoustic signatures of different types of engines, at identifying the specific sound patterns that indicated mechanical problems or tactical maneuvers. The program had been designed to create a new type of soldier, one who could operate in environments where conventional weapons were ineffective or inappropriate. Ethan had been trained for missions that required surgical precision, situations where collateral damage was unacceptable and subtlety was more important than brute force. He had learned to incapacitate enemies without killing them, to disable equipment without destroying it, to gather intelligence through acoustic surveillance methods that were virtually undetectable. But the most important aspect of his training had been psychological. The program's instructors had understood that wielding sound as a weapon required a different kind of mental discipline than traditional combat. Sound was invisible, intangible, capable of affecting people in ways they couldn't understand or defend against. The temptation to abuse such power was enormous, and the program had invested heavily in ensuring that its graduates understood the ethical implications of their abilities. Ethan's grandfather had been his primary instructor in this area, teaching him that acoustic weapons were tools of last resort, to be used only when conventional methods had failed and lives were at stake. The old man had shared stories from his own military career, describing weapons he had helped design that could level city blocks or disable entire enemy divisions. He had made Ethan understand that with great power came the responsibility to use it wisely, to never let the ability to hurt people become a desire to hurt them. The accident that had ended Ethan's military career had occurred during a field test of a new prototype weapon designed to disable improvised explosive devices through targeted frequency bursts. The device had malfunctioned, creating a feedback loop that had damaged Ethan's hearing and left him with permanent tinnitus. The injury had been enough to disqualify him from active duty, but it had also served as a constant reminder of the destructive potential of the forces he had learned to control. The medical discharge had come with a generous settlement package and a college scholarship, but it had also come with a stern warning about the classified nature of his training. Ethan had been required to sign documents promising never to reveal the details of the program or to use his knowledge for unauthorized purposes. The threat of prosecution under the Espionage Act had been made clear, as had the understanding that his former colleagues would be watching to ensure his compliance. But beyond the legal restrictions, Ethan had his grandfather's moral teachings to guide him. The old man had died 3 months after Ethan's discharge, leaving behind only the Martin guitar and a final conversation about the responsibility that came with the ability to hurt people. "Son," his grandfather had said, his voice weak but determined, "you've been given knowledge that most people can't even imagine. You know things that could make you rich, that could make you powerful, that could make you feared. But I want you to promise me something. Promise me you'll only use what you know to protect people who can't protect themselves. Promise me you'll never become the kind of person who hurts others just because he can." Ethan had made that promise, and he had kept it through 2 years of civilian life, through the loneliness of the foster care system, through the challenges of trying to fit in at schools where his classmates had no idea what he had seen and done. He had learned to suppress his training, to pretend that he was just another awkward teenager struggling with the normal problems of high school life. But the knowledge was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of his consciousness. He couldn't listen to music without analyzing its frequency spectrum, couldn't walk into a room without automatically mapping its acoustic properties, couldn't hear a car engine without identifying its make and model from the sound alone. The tinnitus in his damaged ear served as a constant reminder of the weapons he had learned to build and the destruction he had witnessed. Sometimes, late at night when the foster home was quiet and he was alone with his guitar, Ethan would allow himself to remember what it felt like to have that kind of power. He would recall the precision of a perfectly calculated frequency burst, the satisfaction of disabling an enemy system without harming a single person, the rush of using sound itself as a tool of justice. But then he would think of his grandfather's words, of the promise he had made, and he would force himself to focus on the gentle melodies that had been passed down through generations of his family. The irony was not lost on him that Jake Morrison and his crew were trying to intimidate him with crude psychological warfare when he possessed knowledge that could reduce their entire social hierarchy to rubble in a matter of minutes. He knew exactly which frequencies would cause maximum discomfort without permanent damage, exactly how to modulate his voice to create subconscious fear responses, exactly how to use the acoustic properties of the school building to amplify his presence in ways that would make him seem larger and more threatening than he actually was. But using any of that knowledge would mean breaking his promise to his grandfather, and Ethan was determined to honor the old man's memory regardless of the personal cost. He would endure whatever Jake Morrison threw at him, would absorb the psychological abuse and social humiliation, would find a way to survive the next 6 months without compromising the principles that had been instilled in him by the only person who had ever truly cared about his welfare. Question was whether his resolve would hold when the real testing began. The systematic harassment began the following Monday morning with surgical precision. executed with the kind of methodical cruelty that could only come from years of practice and refinement. Jake Morrison had spent the weekend developing a comprehensive strategy for breaking Ethan Cross, a multi-pronged campaign designed to isolate him socially, humiliate him publicly, and destroy his sense of safety within the school environment. The plan was ambitious in its scope and devastating in its execution, targeting not just Ethan's emotional well-being, but his entire support system and daily routine. The first phase involved character assassination through carefully orchestrated rumors and social media manipulation. Tyler Rodriguez had been tasked with creating fake social media accounts that would spread damaging stories about Ethan's past, painting him as everything from a drug dealer to a violent criminal to a mentally unstable loner who posed a threat to other students. The rumors were crafted to be just believable enough to stick, playing on existing prejudices about foster kids and military families while being vague enough to avoid direct confrontation or legal liability. Within hours of the campaign's launch, whispers began following Ethan through the hallways of Riverside High. Students who had never spoken to him before suddenly seemed to know intimate details about his supposed criminal record, his alleged history of violence, his imagined psychological problems. The rumors spread through the school's social networks like wildfire, amplified by the natural tendency of teenagers to believe and repeat scandalous stories about their peers. By Tuesday morning, Ethan had become the subject of hushed conversations and sideways glances, his reputation poisoned by lies he wasn't even aware had been told. The second phase targeted his physical environment and personal belongings. Marcus Chun had been assigned to make Ethan's daily experience at school as unpleasant as possible through a series of escalating pranks and violations. It started small: textbooks disappearing from his locker, homework assignments vanishing from his backpack, his combination lock being changed during lunch periods. But as the week progressed, the harassment became more invasive and destructive. Ethan would arrive at school to find his locker vandalized with permanent marker, obscene graffiti covering the metal surface in thick black letters that custodial staff claimed were too difficult to remove. His textbooks would be found in trash cans, their pages torn and soaked with sticky soda that made them impossible to read. Someone had managed to obtain his class schedule and had been leaving threatening notes in his desk during every period. Messages that were vague enough to avoid disciplinary action, but specific enough to make him feel constantly watched and threatened. The psychological pressure extended beyond school hours through a campaign of digital harassment that followed him home to his foster family's house. Anonymous phone calls would wake him in the middle of the night, heavy breathing or silence on the other end of the line. His email account was flooded with spam and threatening messages sent from untraceable addresses. Someone had found his small YouTube channel and had begun posting hateful comments on every video he had uploaded, mocking his guitar playing and making cruel jokes about his grandfather's death. The most insidious aspect of the harassment was how it had been designed to appear random and disconnected, making it difficult for Ethan to prove that he was being systematically targeted. Each individual incident could be dismissed as teenage pranks or coincidence, but the cumulative effect was overwhelming. Teachers and administrators, when approached, would express sympathy but claim they couldn't take action without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. The harassment existed in the gray areas of school policy, technically crossing lines, but never quite reaching the threshold that would trigger official intervention. Jake Morrison had studied the psychology of institutional failure, understanding that schools were designed to handle obvious cases of bullying but struggled with more sophisticated forms of psychological warfare. He had crafted his campaign to exploit these weaknesses, creating a situation where Ethan was clearly suffering but couldn't access the support systems that were theoretically available to him. The genius of the plan lay in its deniability. If confronted, Jake and his crew could claim innocence while pointing to the lack of direct evidence linking them to any Specific incident. The social isolation component of the harassment was perhaps the most effective element of Jake's strategy. Through a combination of threats and social pressure, he had managed to turn Ethan into a pariah within the school community. Students who might have been friendly toward him were warned away through rumors about his supposed violence and instability. Teachers who might have offered support were subtly discouraged through whispered concerns about his mental health and potential for dangerous behavior. The few students who attempted to reach out to Ethan found themselves becoming targets of secondary harassment. Amy Patterson, a quiet girl from his physics class who had tried to invite him to join her study group, suddenly found herself the subject of ugly rumors about her appearance and social life. Brian Walsh, a fellow musician who had approached Ethan about collaborating on a song, discovered that his own guitar had been vandalized in the same way as Ethan's locker. The message was clear: association with Ethan Cross would result in becoming a target yourself. The harassment followed a carefully planned escalation schedule, with each week bringing new forms of torment designed to push Ethan closer to his breaking point. What had started as verbal taunts and social exclusion had evolved into property destruction and personal threats. The attacks were becoming more frequent and more personal, targeting not just his reputation, but his most cherished possessions and memories. The guitar case became a particular focus of the harassment campaign. Jake had identified it as Ethan's most vulnerable point, the one possession that seemed to matter more to him than anything else. Students had been recruited to accidentally bump into him in the hallways, causing the case to fall and potentially damage the instrument inside. During lunch periods, unknown individuals would approach his table and make crude comments about the guitar, suggesting that it looked expensive and wondering aloud whether someone might want to steal it. The psychological toll of the constant pressure was beginning to show in Ethan's behavior and appearance. His grades, which had been excellent during his first week at the school, began to slip as he found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on his studies. Dark circles appeared under his eyes as the anonymous phone calls and digital harassment disrupted his sleep. His appetite diminished as the stress of navigating the hostile school environment made it difficult to eat, but perhaps most significantly, the harassment was beginning to erode the careful emotional control that Ethan had developed through years of military training and personal discipline. The constant state of hypervigilance required to navigate Jake's psychological minefield was exhausting, and Ethan found himself struggling to maintain the calm, peaceful demeanor that had served as his protection for so long. Small incidents that he would have previously ignored were beginning to trigger flashes of anger and frustration that he was finding increasingly difficult to suppress. The foster family he was staying with, the Hendersons, had begun to notice changes in his behavior, but attributed them to normal teenage adjustment issues. They had no way of knowing about the sophisticated campaign of harassment he was enduring, and Ethan had no desire to burden them with problems that he believed he should be able to handle on his own. The isolation was complete. He was fighting Jake Morrison's psychological warfare campaign entirely alone, with no allies and no support system to fall back on. As the third week of harassment concluded, Ethan realized that Jake's strategy was working exactly as intended. He was being systematically broken down, isolated from potential allies, and pushed toward a breaking point that would either result in his complete submission or his explosive retaliation. Either outcome would serve Jake's purposes. Submission would confirm his dominance and provide entertainment for his followers, while retaliation would allow him to play the victim and mobilize the school's disciplinary system against Ethan. The only question remaining was which outcome Ethan would choose when the final pressure was applied. The public humiliation came during what should have been Ethan's safe haven, the weekly talent show auditions that took place every Friday afternoon in the school's main auditorium. Mrs. Patterson, the music teacher, had been encouraging students to participate in the upcoming winter showcase. and several students had signed up to demonstrate their abilities for the selection committee. Ethan had reluctantly agreed to audition after Mrs. Patterson had heard him quietly playing his guitar during lunch and had been impressed by his technical skill and emotional expression. The auditorium was packed with students and teachers, creating the perfect stage for the kind of public spectacle that Jake Morrison specialized in orchestrating. Ethan had been scheduled to perform fifth on the list, giving him time to sit in the back row and observe the other auditions while fighting the growing anxiety that came with performing in front of such a large crowd. His grandfather's Martin guitar rested in its case beside him, and he had been quietly reviewing the fingering for the classical piece he had chosen to perform. The first 4 auditions had gone smoothly, a soprano singing an aria from a popular musical, a jazz pianist performing an original composition, a string quartet playing a movement from a Mozart piece, and a folk singer accompanied by her own guitar. The audience had been respectful and attentive, applauding politely after each performance and maintaining the kind of quiet dignity that was expected at such events. Mrs. Patterson had been taking notes at the judges' table, occasionally whispering comments to the other faculty members who were helping with the selection process. When Ethan's name was called, he stood slowly and made his way to the front of the auditorium, his guitar case in hand and his heart pounding with the kind of nervous energy that he hadn't felt since his first military training exercises. Stage lights were bright enough to make it difficult to see individual faces in the audience, which he hoped would help him focus on his performance rather than the judgment of his peers. He had chosen to play a piece that his grandfather had taught him, a complex classical guitar arrangement that required precise fingering and emotional interpretation. As he opened his guitar case and began tuning the instrument, he could hear whispers from the audience that seemed louder and more disruptive than they had been during the previous performances. Someone in the middle section was making comments about his appearance, wondering aloud whether the weird foster kid could actually play or if he was just wasting everyone's time. The comments were just loud enough to be heard by those nearby, but not quite loud enough to prompt intervention from the supervising teachers. Ethan tried to ignore the distractions and focus on his tuning, but the constant low-level chatter was making it difficult to hear the subtle pitch variations that were essential for proper intonation. His trained ears, already hypersensitive from years of acoustic warfare training, picked up every whispered comment and suppressed laugh, creating a cacophony of psychological pressure that threatened to overwhelm his concentration. The tinnitus in his damaged ear seemed to grow louder, adding another layer of distraction to an already challenging situation. "Are you ready, Ethan?" Mrs. Patterson called from the judge's table, her voice carrying a note of concern as she noticed his hesitation. The question snapped him back to attention, and he nodded, positioning his fingers on the fretboard for the opening passage of the piece. The first few measures went smoothly, his muscle memory taking over as he began the intricate melody that had been passed down through generations of classical guitarists. But as he reached the first technically challenging section, the whispers from the audience began to escalate into something more disruptive. Jake Morrison, who had positioned himself strategically in the center of the auditorium with Tyler and Marcus flanking him, began a campaign of psychological warfare that was designed to destroy Ethan's concentration and humiliate him in front of the entire school community. "Listen to this guy," Jake said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearby sections, but not quite loud enough to be clearly identified by the supervising teachers. "He thinks he's some kind of guitar god or something. Probably learned to play in juvie." Tyler picked up the thread immediately, adding his own commentary in the same calculated tone. "I heard he stole that guitar from his last foster family. Probably why he had to move here in the first place." The lie was delivered with such casual confidence that several students in the surrounding seats began to nod and whisper among themselves. The false narrative spreading through the audience like wildfire, Marcus contributed. his own element to the disruption by deliberately creating small disturbances, dropping his backpack on the floor with a loud thud, rustling through papers in his pocket, tapping his foot against the seat in front of him in a rhythm that was just slightly off from the tempo of Ethan's performance. Each individual action was minor enough to avoid official notice, but collectively they created a pattern of disruption that was designed to throw off Ethan's timing and concentration. The psychological assault was having its intended effect. Ethan could feel his fingers beginning to stumble over passages that he had played flawlessly thousands of times before, his muscle memory disrupted by the constant stream of negative input from the audience. The classical piece he had chosen required absolute precision and emotional focus, qualities that were impossible to maintain while under such sustained psychological attack. As he reached the climax of the piece, a technically demanding passage that showcased both his skill and his emotional connection to the music, Jake Morrison escalated his campaign to its most destructive level. "Hey everyone," he called out, his voice now loud enough to be heard throughout the auditorium. "Check out the sad orphan boy trying to play his dead grandpa's guitar. This is what happens when you let charity cases into real schools." The comment hit Ethan like a physical blow, striking directly at the emotional core of his relationship with his grandfather, and the instrument that represented his only connection to the man who had raised him. His fingers froze on the fretboard, the melody dying in mid-phrase as the cruel accuracy of Jake's psychological targeting rendered him temporarily unable to continue. The auditorium fell silent for a moment, the kind of awkward quiet that comes when a social boundary has been crossed and everyone present recognizes that something inappropriate has occurred. Mrs. Patterson stood up from the judge's table, her face flushed with anger as she prepared to address the disruption. But the damage had already been done. Ethan sat on the stage with his grandfather's guitar in his lap, his face burning with humiliation as 400 pairs of eyes stared at him with a mixture of pity, curiosity, and second-hand embarrassment. The piece he had chosen to honor his grandfather's memory had been transformed into a public spectacle of his own vulnerability, his most cherished possession turned into a prop in Jake Morrison's theater of cruelty. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the sound of scattered laughter from Jake's section and the uncomfortable shuffling of feet as the audience waited to see how the situation would be resolved. Some students looked genuinely sympathetic, recognizing that they had just witnessed something that crossed the line from typical teenage meanness into genuine cruelty. Others seemed entertained by the drama, their phones already out to record whatever would happen next. Mrs. Patterson finally found her voice, her words sharp with authority as she addressed the audience. "That's enough. Anyone who can't behave respectfully during these auditions can leave immediately." But her intervention came too late to undo the damage that had been done to Ethan's dignity and his relationship with his music. Ethan looked down at his grandfather's guitar, seeing not just the instrument, but the representation of everything he had lost and everything he was trying to protect. The Martin D28 had survived decades of use, had been passed down through generations of musicians, had provided comfort and connection during the darkest periods of his life. Now it felt tainted by the public humiliation he had just endured. Transformed from a source of strength into a reminder of his vulnerability, he stood slowly, his movements mechanical as he placed the guitar back in its case and walked off the stage. The audience remained silent as he made his way up the aisle toward the exit, his head held high despite the burning shame that threatened to overwhelm him. Jake Morrison's campaign had achieved its intended result. Ethan Cross had been publicly humiliated in front of the entire school community, marked as a victim and stripped of the dignity that had been his only protection. But as he reached the auditorium doors, something fundamental shifted Ethan's psychology. The humiliation was complete, the social destruction absolute, and the promise to his grandfather felt increasingly like a luxury he could no longer afford. The breaking point was approaching, and Jake Morrison had no idea what forces he had just set in motion. The breaking point came on a gray October afternoon when the autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Ethan had been walking toward the parking lot after another day of enduring Jake Morrison's psychological warfare, his grandfather's guitar case slung over his shoulder and his backpack weighing heavy with textbooks he could barely concentrate on anymore. The past month had worn him down to a raw nerve, every day bringing new humiliations and fresh attacks on his dignity and his connection to the only family he had ever known. He had developed a routine for survival: head down, eyes forward, move quickly through the hallways and avoid any area where Jake and his crew might be waiting. The strategy had worked reasonably well during school hours, but the parking lot remained dangerous territory, a no-man's land where the normal rules of classroom behavior didn't apply, and teachers had no authority to intervene. Ethan had learned to time his departures carefully, waiting until most students had left before making his way to the bus stop, where he could catch a ride back to the Hendersons' house. But today was different. Today, Jake Morrison had been waiting for him with the patience of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. The confrontation had been planned with military precision, timed to coincide with the end of football practice when the coaching staff would be busy in the locker rooms, and the parking lot would be mostly empty except for a few stragglers heading home. Jake had positioned himself and his crew near the bike racks, a location that would force Ethan to pass within striking distance if he wanted to reach his usual exit route. Well, if it isn't our favorite musician," Jake called out as Ethan approached, his voice carrying the mock friendliness that had become his trademark. "How's the guitar playing going, Ethan? Still serenading the dead relatives?" Ethan tried to walk past them without engagement, but Tyler and Marcus had positioned themselves to block his path, creating a human barrier that forced him to stop and acknowledge their presence. The setup was familiar, the same tactical formation they had used dozens of times before to trap him in conversations he didn't want to have in situations he couldn't escape from. "Don't be rude, man," Tyler said, his nervous energy more pronounced than usual. "We're just trying to have a friendly conversation. You know, catch up on how things are going for you." "Things are going fine," Ethan replied quietly, adjusting his grip on the guitar case and looking for an alternate route around them. But Marcus had anticipated this move, stepping sideways to cut off any possible escape path. The three of them had formed a triangle around him, close enough to seem casual to any distant observer, but tight enough to make it clear that he was trapped. "Fine," Jake repeated, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like things have been pretty rough for you lately. All those rumors going around, all those little accidents with your stuff. Must be hard being the school's designated punching bag." The words hit their target with surgical precision, acknowledging Jake's role in the harassment campaign while maintaining plausible deniability. Ethan felt his jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain calm, to project the same passive vulnerability that had been his shield for the past month. "I just want to go home," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Home?" Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and without humor. "You mean your foster home? The place where they're just counting down the days until you age out and become someone else's problem." The comment revealed how much research Jake's crew had done into Ethan's personal situation, how thoroughly they had mapped his vulnerabilities and insecurities. "See, that's what I don't understand about you," Jake continued, stepping closer until he was less than 2 feet away from Ethan. "You take all this abuse, all this humiliation, and you just accept it, like you think you deserve it or something. Like you're so grateful to be allowed to exist that you'll let anyone treat you however they want." Ethan could feel his heart rate increasing, his body's natural fight-or-flight response activating in response to the perceived threat. His military training was screaming at him to act, to neutralize the threat before it could escalate further. But his grandfather's voice was still louder, still reminding him of the promise he had made to use his abilities only as a last resort. Maybe. That's how they trained you in foster care, Tyler added, his voice gaining confidence as he fed off Jake's energy. Maybe they taught you that your job is just to shut up and take whatever people want to dish out. Is that it, Ethan? Are you just too broken to fight back? The psychological attack was becoming more vicious, more personal, targeting not just his current situation, but his entire history of abandonment and institutional care. Jake Morrison had done his homework, studying Ethan's psychological profile, with the dedication of someone who understood that the most effective weapons were the ones that attacked the mind rather than the body. I think he's scared, Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of mock pity. I think he's so terrified of getting hurt that he'd rather just curl up in a ball and let everyone walk all over him. That's what happens when you don't have a real family to teach you how to be a man. The comment about family was the first crack in Ethan's emotional armor, the first words to penetrate the careful psychological defenses he had built around his grief and his sense of loss. His grandfather had been his real family, the only person who had ever cared about him unconditionally, and Jake Morrison was using that relationship as ammunition in his campaign of cruelty. Leave my family out of this, Ethan said, his voice still quiet but carrying a new undertone of warning that made Jake's eyes light up with interest. The reaction was exactly what Jake had been hoping for, the first sign that Ethan's legendary calm was beginning to crack. Family? Jake repeated, his grin widening. What family? You mean the grandfather who stuck you in foster care instead of taking care of you himself? The one who left you that beat-up old guitar instead of something useful like money or a place to live? The words were like physical blows, each one designed to strike at the core of Ethan's identity and his connection to the only person who had ever loved him. Jake Morrison had identified the precise psychological pressure points that would cause maximum damage, and he was applying that pressure with the skill of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of emotional destruction. That guitar is all you have left of him, isn't it? Jake continued, his voice becoming softer, more intimate, as if he were sharing a secret. That's why you carry it around everywhere, why you get so upset when people make fun of it. It's not really about the music at all. It's about pretending that you still have someone who cares about you. Ethan's grip on the guitar case tightened involuntarily, his knuckles going white as he struggled to maintain his emotional equilibrium. The case felt heavier in his hands, weighted down not just with the instrument inside, but with all the memories and emotions that it represented. His grandfather's face flashed through his mind, the patient smile, the gentle hands guiding his fingers on the fretboard, the proud expression when he had finally mastered a particularly difficult piece. You know what I think? Jake said, stepping even closer until they were almost touching. I think you're holding onto that guitar because you're too weak to accept that you're completely alone in the world. I think you're using it as a security blanket, like a little kid who can't sleep without his teddy bear. The analogy was deliberately infantilizing, designed to strip away whatever remaining dignity Ethan might have felt about his attachment to his grandfather's memory. But it was also dangerously accurate, hitting closer to the truth than Jake Morrison could have realized. The guitar was indeed Ethan's connection to his past, his anchor in a world that had repeatedly proven itself to be hostile and unpredictable. Maybe it's time you learn to let go, Tyler suggested, his voice carrying a note of false concern. Maybe it's time you stopped living in the past and started dealing with reality. Reality, Marcus echoed, his tone becoming more menacing. Like the reality that you're nothing special, that you don't matter to anyone, that the world would be exactly the same if you just disappeared tomorrow. The three of them had formed a tighter circle now, their voices creating a symphony of psychological destruction that was designed to overwhelm Ethan's emotional defenses and push him toward the breaking point that they had been working toward for weeks. But they had made a crucial miscalculation, They had assumed that breaking Ethan would result in his complete surrender, his final acceptance of his role as their victim. They had no idea that they were about to cross a line that would transform him from a passive target into something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The grandfather's guitar was not just a symbol of his past. It was the focal point of a promise that had kept Ethan's most destructive capabilities in check for 2 years. And Jake Morrison was about to discover what happened when that promise was finally broken. "You want to know what I think?" Jake said, reaching out slowly toward the guitar case. "I think it's time someone taught you a lesson about reality." The moment Jake Morrison's hand made contact with the guitar case, something fundamental shifted in Ethan Cross's neural pathways, a transformation so complete and instantaneous that it could be measured in milliseconds rather than minutes. The careful psychological barriers he had constructed around his military training began to crumble like a dam bursting under pressure, releasing 4 years of suppressed tactical knowledge and combat instincts that had been held in check by nothing more than a dying man's words and a teenager's desperate need to believe in something greater than violence. The first change was in his breathing, the shallow, anxious respirations of a cornered victim replaced by the deep, controlled breaths of someone who had been trained to operate in life or death situations. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, his shoulders squaring in a way that suggested he was no longer trying to make himself smaller and less noticeable. The guitar case in his hands shifted from a burden to be protected into something that could be weaponized if necessary, its weight and dimensions automatically cataloged by muscle memory that had been dormant for too long. Jake Morrison was still talking, his voice carrying the same mocking tone that had served him so well in previous encounters, but Ethan was no longer listening to the words. Instead, his combat-trained mind was processing the acoustic environment around them, mapping the angles and distances, identifying potential weapons and escape routes, and calculating the exact sequence of actions that would neutralize the threat with maximum efficiency and minimal collateral damage. The tinnitus in his damaged ear seemed to fade into the background, overwhelmed by the sudden clarity of purpose that came with the decision to stop running and start fighting. "You know what your problem is?" Jake continued, his fingers tightening on the guitar case as he prepared to yank it away from Ethan. "You think you're special. You think you're different from everyone else. But you're just another foster kid who doesn't know his place in the world." The words were intended to be the final psychological blow, the coup de grace that would complete Ethan's emotional destruction and cement Jake's dominance over him. But instead of breaking down, Ethan found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in 2 years, the cold, calculating calm that came with the knowledge that he was no longer bound by the promise that had kept him passive. His grandfather's voice, which had been a constant presence in his mind for months, was suddenly silent, replaced by the voice of Admiral Reynolds and the other instructors who had shaped him into a human weapon. "Let go of the case, Jake," Ethan sighed, his voice carrying a new quality that made Tyler and Marcus exchange uncertain glances. The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but there was something in the tone that suggested they were not a request, but a warning. The psychological profile of a victim had been replaced by something far more dangerous, the controlled confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was capable of and was no longer afraid to use it. Jake Morrison, however, was too intoxicated by his own sense of power to recognize the shift in dynamics. He had spent weeks building up to this moment, orchestrating a campaign of psychological warfare that had been designed to culminate in this final act of dominance. The guitar case represented everything he had been working to destroy: Ethan's connection to his past, his sense of identity, his last remaining source of emotional strength. Or what? Jake challenged, his grip on the case tightening as he prepared to rip it away. "What are you going to do about it? Cry? Run to the principal? Face it, Ethan. You're weak, you're pathetic, and you're never going to be anything more than a victim." The psychological attack that would have devastated Ethan, just minutes before, now bounced off him like water off steel. His mind was operating on a different frequency now, processing information through neural pathways that had been forged in the crucible of military training and combat preparation. Jake Morrison was no longer a tormentor to be endured, but a target to be neutralized. And Ethan's tactical mind was already calculating the most efficient way to accomplish that objective. "I'm going to give you one more chance," Ethan said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Let go of the case and walk away. This doesn't have to end badly for you." The warning was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that military personnel extended to civilians who had wandered into dangerous situations without understanding the risks. It was the same tone that explosive ordnance disposal experts used when telling people to evacuate a building, or that snipers used when warning targets to surrender before the shooting started. But Jake Morrison had no frame of reference for understanding that level of controlled lethality, no experience with the kind of person who could deliver death threats in the same calm voice that others used to discuss the weather. "End badly." "For me?" Jake laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You still don't get it, do you? You're not in control here. You're never going to be in control. You're just a broken kid with a broken guitar, and it's time you learned that." With those words, Jake Morrison yanked the guitar case away from Ethan with sudden violence, the leather handle slipping from Ethan's deliberately relaxed grip. Case hit the asphalt with a sickening crash, the sound of splintering wood audible even through the protective padding as the priceless Martin D28 inside absorbed the impact. But Jake wasn't finished. He had planned this moment too carefully to settle for a simple act of theft. "Oops," he said with theatrical concern, raising his foot above the fallen case. "Looks like someone's about to have an accident." Time seemed to slow as Jake's boot began its descent toward the guitar case, the movement tracked by Ethan's enhanced perception with the kind of detailed precision that came from years of training. In high-speed combat situations, he could see every detail of the attack, the angle of Jake's leg, the exact point where the boot would make contact, the amount of force that would be transmitted through the case to the instrument inside. His mind automatically calculated the damage that would result from the impact, the irreparable harm that would be done to the only physical connection he had left to his grandfather. But more than the physical damage, Ethan could see the psychological calculation behind Jake's actions. This wasn't just about destroying a guitar, it was about destroying the last vestige of hope and connection that kept Ethan tethered to something greater than himself. Jake Morrison had identified the exact pressure point that would cause maximum emotional damage, and he was applying that pressure with the precision of a surgeon and the cruelty of a sociopath. The boot made contact with the guitar case with a sound like thunder, the impact driving the instrument against the asphalt with enough force to crack the wooden body inside. But the sound of breaking wood was overwhelmed by something else, a low, subsonic frequency that seemed to emerge from Ethan himself, a harmonic vibration that made the air around them shimmer with barely contained energy. Jake Morrison looked up from his act of destruction to find Ethan Cross staring at him with eyes that had gone completely cold, the last traces of the frightened teenager replaced by something that made Tyler and Marcus take involuntary steps backward. The transformation was complete, the promise had been broken, the restraints removed, and the weapon that Admiral Reynolds had spent 4 years creating was finally free to operate without restriction. "You have no idea what you just did, Ethan," sighed, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone within hearing distance. "You have no idea what you just unleashed." The words were spoken with the calm certainty of someone who had just watched an enemy cross a line that could never be uncrossed, who had just witnessed the destruction of something that could never be repaired or replaced. Jake Morrison had wanted to break Ethan Cross, to reduce him to nothing more than a broken victim who would serve as entertainment for his crew. Instead, he had just freed something far more dangerous than he could have. Imagined, a human being who had been trained to use sound itself as a weapon, and who no longer had any reason to hold back. The reckoning was about to begin. What happened next defied every expectation that Jake Morrison had built up during his weeks of psychological warfare against Ethan Cross. The broken guitar case lay between them on the asphalt, the sound of splintered wood still echoing in the empty parking lot. But instead of the emotional breakdown that Jake had been orchestrating, he found himself facing something that made every instinct in his body scream warnings about immediate and overwhelming danger. Ethan Cross was no longer the passive victim who had endured weeks of harassment with quiet dignity. The transformation was so complete and so instantaneous that it seemed to violate the basic laws of human psychology. His posture had shifted from defensive to predatory. His breathing had become controlled and rhythmic, and his eyes had taken on the kind of focused intensity that Jake had only seen in nature documentaries about apex predators selecting their prey. "You want to know what I really am?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying frequencies that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the chest cavity. The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but they carried an undertone of controlled violence that made Tyler and Marcus exchange panicked glances. "I'm not a foster kid. I'm not a victim. I'm a former United States Navy acoustic warfare specialist who spent 4 years learning how to kill people with sound." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything he thought. He knew about his target. The quiet demeanor, the avoidance of conflict, the desperate attempts to remain invisible. None of it had been a weakness. It had been the self-control of someone who understood exactly what he was capable of and had been choosing not to use it. "That's impossible," Jake said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're 17 years old. You can't be in the military." "I enlisted at 14 through a classified program," Ethan replied, taking a step closer to the three boys. "I spent 4 years learning to use sound as a weapon. I can calculate the exact frequency needed to disrupt your inner ear and send you into uncontrollable vertigo. I can modulate my voice to create subsonic vibrations that will make you vomit. I can whistle at a pitch that will cause permanent hearing damage from 50 feet away." As he spoke, Ethan began to demonstrate the truth of his claims. His voice took on a harmonic quality that seemed to come from multiple sources at once, creating standing waves in the air that made the metal surfaces of nearby cars vibrate sympathetically. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emerge from the ground itself, making the asphalt beneath their feet vibrate. With barely contained energy, Tyler was the first to feel the effects. The subsonic frequencies that Ethan was generating began to interfere with his inner ear, creating a sensation of movement and disorientation that made him stumble sideways into a parked car. His face went pale as his body struggled to maintain balance against the artificial vertigo that Ethan was inducing through precise acoustic manipulation. "Stop it," Tyler gasped, pressing his hands to his ears in a futile attempt to block out the frequencies that were affecting him. "Whatever you're doing, stop it." But Ethan was just getting started. 4 years of training had taught him to use his voice as a precision instrument, capable of targeting specific individuals within a crowd without affecting anyone else. He adjusted the frequency slightly, adding harmonics that were calculated to interfere with Marcus's larger body mass and different resonant frequencies. Marcus, who had built his reputation on physical intimidation and brute force, suddenly found himself experiencing something he had never encountered before, a form of attack that couldn't be blocked or countered through conventional means. The acoustic assault bypassed his muscles and his fighting skills, targeting his nervous system directly through frequencies that his body was evolutionarily unprepared to handle. "What are you?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the subsonic hum that seemed to be emanating from Ethan's entire body. "What kind of freak are you?" The kind of freak who learned to weaponize physics, Ethan replied, his voice taking on additional harmonics that made the air around him shimmer like heat waves. The kind of freak who can turn sound into a surgical instrument. The kind of freak who can make you wish you'd never been born without laying a finger on you. Jake Morrison, who had built his entire identity around his ability to dominate and control others, found himself facing something that operated on principles he couldn't understand or counter. The psychological warfare that had served him so well for years was useless against someone who had been trained in actual warfare, who understood violence on a level that transcended high school social dynamics. "You're bluffing," Jake said, but his voice was shaking now. "You're just trying to scare us. You can't really do the things you're claiming." In response, Ethan focused his attention on Jake specifically, adjusting his vocal output to create a frequency that would resonate with Jake's specific body mass and bone density. The effect was immediate and devastating. Jake's vision began to blur as the acoustic assault interfered with the fluid in his inner ear, creating a sensation of spinning that made him grab onto a nearby car for support. "I spent 4 years learning to use sound as a weapon," Ethan continued, his voice now carrying multiple harmonic layers that created a wall of acoustic pressure around the 3 boys. "I can create frequencies that will make you lose control of your bowels. I can generate sound waves that will cause microfractures in your bones. I can whistle at a pitch that will burst your eardrums and leave you deaf for the rest of your life." The demonstration was becoming more intense with each passing second. Ethan's voice was no longer entirely human. It had taken on qualities that seemed to come from multiple sources at once, creating interference patterns in the air that made the metal surfaces of nearby cars ring like bells. The acoustic environment around them had become a weapon, turned against Jake and his crew with the precision of someone who understood exactly how sound waves interacted with human physiology. "But you know what the beautiful thing about acoustic warfare is?" Ethan asked, his voice now carrying frequencies that seemed to come from inside their own heads. "It's invisible. It's untraceable. If I wanted to, I could rupture your internal organs right now, and the autopsy would show that you died of natural causes. Heart failure, brain aneurysm, internal bleeding, all explainable by medical science, all impossible to trace back to me." Tyler had collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed to his ears as he struggled to cope with the artificial vertigo that Ethan was inducing. Marcus was leaning against a car, his face green with nausea as the subsonic frequencies interfered with his digestive system. Jake was still standing, but barely, his grip on the car beside him, the only thing keeping him upright as the acoustic assault continued to intensify. "Please," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please stop. We're sorry. We didn't know." "Sorry?" Ethan repeated, his voice taking on a mocking quality that somehow made the acoustic assault even more unbearable. "You're sorry? You spent weeks trying to destroy me psychologically. You humiliated me in front of the entire school. You broke the only thing I had left of my grandfather. And now you're sorry?" The frequency of his voice shifted again, adding new harmonics that seemed to target their bones directly. All 3 boys were now experiencing pain that they had no frame of reference for understanding, not the sharp, immediate pain of physical injury, but the deep, systemic discomfort that came from having their bodies' natural resonant frequencies disrupted by someone who understood exactly how to manipulate acoustic energy. "You wanted to see what I was really capable of," Ethan continued, his voice now carrying enough acoustic energy to make the windows of nearby cars vibrate in their frames. "You wanted to push me until I broke. Well, congratulations, Jake Morrison. You've succeeded. You broke me. But you have no idea what you've unleashed." The revelation was complete. Ethan Cross was no longer pretending to be a helpless victim. He was a weapon that had been disguised as a target, a predator that had been masquerading as prey. And Jake Morrison, who had spent his entire high school career believing that psychological intimidation was the ultimate form of power, was about to learn that there were forces in the world that made his teenage cruelty seem like child's play. In comparison, the acoustic assault was just the beginning. Ethan Cross had 4 years of military training and specialized knowledge that Jake Morrison couldn't even begin to comprehend. And for the first time in his life, Jake Morrison was about to discover what it felt like to be completely and utterly powerless. The transformation in the parking lot's power structure was so complete and so devastating that it seemed to violate the basic laws of social physics that had governed Riverside High School for years. Jake Morrison, who had ruled through fear and intimidation for his entire high school career, was now kneeling on the asphalt with blood trickling from his nose. His body racked with convulsions as Ethan's acoustic assault continued to target his nervous system with surgical precision. Tyler and Marcus had already collapsed completely, their bodies unable to cope with the subsonic frequencies that were disrupting their equilibrium and causing their internal organs to vibrate in ways that human anatomy was never designed to handle. The acoustic environment around them had become a weapon more sophisticated than anything Jake Morrison could have imagined. Ethan's voice was no longer producing sound in any conventional sense. Instead, it was generating precise frequencies that interacted with the resonant properties of human tissue, creating standing waves that could target specific organs or body systems with devastating effect. The parking lot itself had become part of the weapon, its asphalt surface and metal structures serving as acoustic reflectors that amplified and focused the sound waves into concentrated beams of pure sonic energy. You want to know what 4 years of military training really teaches you? Ethan asked, his voice now carrying so many harmonic layers that it seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. It teaches you that there are no rules when your survival is at stake. It teaches you that the only thing that matters is neutralizing the threat before it can harm you or anyone you care about. Jake tried to respond, but the acoustic assault had progressed beyond mere disorientation into something approaching systematic neurological disruption. The frequencies that Ethan was generating were interfering with the electrical signals in his brain, making it difficult to form coherent thoughts or coordinate his movements. His vision was blurring, his hearing was compromised, and his sense of balance had been completely destroyed by the artificial vertigo that Ethan was inducing through precise manipulation of his inner ear. The thing about acoustic warfare, Ethan continued, adjusting the frequency of his voice to target Jake's specific physiological vulnerabilities, is that it's completely invisible to anyone who doesn't understand the science behind it. If a teacher walked out here right now, they'd see 3 students who had suddenly become ill, maybe food poisoning or a flu outbreak. They'd never suspect that they were witnessing a demonstration of weaponized physics. The demonstration was becoming more sophisticated with each passing moment. Ethan was no longer simply generating random frequencies. He was conducting a systematic assault on his target's physiology, using his understanding of human anatomy and acoustic principles to create specific effects in different parts of their bodies. Tyler was experiencing severe nausea as subsonic waves interfered with his digestive system. Marcus was struggling to breathe as higher frequencies caused his lung tissue to vibrate in ways that made normal respiration impossible. Jake was receiving the full spectrum of Ethan's acoustic arsenal, his body under assault from multiple frequencies simultaneously. "You spent weeks studying me," Ethan said, his voice taking on a quality that seemed to resonate from within their own skulls. "You researched my background, you identified my vulnerabilities, you crafted a psychological profile that would let you target my weaknesses with maximum efficiency. Well, let me return the favor." With those words, Ethan began to demonstrate the true extent of his analytical capabilities. His military training had included extensive instruction in rapid psychological assessment and target analysis, skills that had been honed through years of combat preparation and field experience. He had been studying Jake Morrison just as intensively as Jake had been studying him. But his analysis had been conducted through the lens of someone who understood violence on a level that transcended teenage social dynamics. Jake Morrison. Ethan said, his voice now carrying frequencies that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the bone structure of Jake's skull. 17 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, approximately 180 pounds. Father owns Morrison Construction. Mother sits on the school board. Uncle is the county sheriff. You've built your entire identity around your ability to intimidate and control others because you're terrified of being seen as weak or vulnerable. The psychological profile was delivered with the clinical precision of a military intelligence briefing, each detail calculated to demonstrate the depth of Ethan's knowledge and the futility of Jake's position. But unlike Jake's psychological warfare, which had been designed to break down his target's emotional defenses, Ethan's analysis was intended to showcase the tactical superiority that came from real training and genuine expertise. You chose me as a target because you thought I was weak, Ethan continued, the acoustic assault intensifying as he spoke. You saw the quiet demeanor, the avoidance of conflict, the desperate attempts to remain invisible, and you interpreted those behaviors as signs of vulnerability. You had no idea that you were looking at the self-control of someone who had been trained to kill people with his bare hands. Tyler had begun to vomit, his body's natural response to the subsonic frequencies that were disrupting his digestive system. Marcus was clutching his chest, his breathing becoming labored as the acoustic assault interfered with his cardiac rhythm. Jake was experiencing all of these symptoms simultaneously, his body under attack from multiple frequencies that had been precisely calibrated to cause maximum discomfort without permanent damage. The beautiful thing about acoustic warfare, Ethan explained, his voice now carrying enough energy to make the metal surfaces of nearby cars vibrate sympathetically, is that it's completely scalable. I can adjust the frequency and amplitude to create effects ranging from mild discomfort to permanent disability to immediate death. Right now, I'm demonstrating the mild discomfort setting. Would you like to see what the next level looks like? The threat was delivered with the calm professionalism of someone who had been trained to use graduated levels of force, who understood exactly how much pressure to apply to achieve specific tactical objectives. This wasn't the random violence of a teenager who had been pushed too far. This was the controlled application of specialized knowledge by someone who had been trained to use sound as a precision instrument. Jake tried to speak, to beg for mercy, or negotiate some kind of surrender, but the acoustic assault had progressed beyond the point where normal communication was possible. His vocal cords were being affected by the frequencies that Ethan was generating, making it impossible to produce coherent sounds. The psychological tables had been completely turned. Jake Morrison, who had spent weeks systematically destroying Ethan's ability to function normally, was now experiencing what it felt like to be completely powerless in the face of superior force. You wanted to break me, Ethan said, his voice now carrying frequencies that seemed to come from the ground itself. You wanted to reduce me to nothing more than a broken victim who would serve as entertainment for you and your friends. Well, congratulations, Jake Morrison. You succeeded in breaking something, but it wasn't my spirit or my will to resist. What you broke was my promise to my grandfather that I would never use my training against someone who didn't deserve it. The revelation carried the weight of genuine tragedy, not just for Jake Morrison and his crew, who were experiencing the consequences of their actions, but for Ethan himself, who had been forced to abandon the moral principles that had guided his behavior for 2 years. The promise to his grandfather had been the only thing standing between Jake Morrison and the full weight of 4 years of military training. And now that barrier had been removed, the new order was established not through negotiation or gradual change, but through the immediate and overwhelming demonstration of superior force. Jake Morrison's reign of terror at Riverside High School had ended not with a whimper, but with a lesson in the difference between teenage cruelty and actual warfare, between psychological intimidation and genuine lethality. The parking lot had become a classroom, and Ethan Cross had just taught Jake Morrison the most important lesson of his life, that there were forces in the world that made his high school dominance seem like child's play in comparison. The aftermath of the acoustic demonstration spread through Riverside High School like wildfire, carried by the few students who had witnessed the parking lot confrontation from a distance and the whispered testimonies of Jake Morrison's crew during their 3-day absence from school. The official story, as reported to the administration and the local authorities, was that all 3 boys had been struck by a sudden and severe case of food poisoning that had required medical attention and several days of recovery. But the unofficial version, the one that circulated through text messages and social media posts, painted a picture of something far more extraordinary and terrifying. The transformation in the school's social ecosystem was immediate and comprehensive. Jake Morrison, who had returned to school pale and shaken, no longer commanded the automatic respect and fear that had been his currency for 4 years. His usual swagger had been replaced by a nervous energy that suggested he was constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next demonstration of the forces he had unwittingly unleashed. Tyler and Marcus flanked him in the hallways, but their presence no longer projected strength. Instead, they seemed like wounded animals seeking safety in numbers. The stories that emerged from their experience varied in detail but were consistent in their essential message. Ethan Cross was not what he appeared to be, and crossing him would result in consequences that transcended anything their teenage minds could comprehend. Some students claimed that Jake had been found unconscious in the parking lot, blood streaming from his nose and ears. Others whispered that all 3 boys had been hospitalized with mysterious symptoms that doctors couldn't explain. The most persistent rumor suggested that Ethan had done something to them using only his voice, that he possessed some kind of supernatural ability to hurt people without touching them. The truth, as it often does, proved to be more disturbing than any of the rumors. Jake Morrison had indeed been subjected to an acoustic assault that had pushed his body to the very limits of what it could endure without permanent damage. The subsonic frequencies that Ethan had generated had caused temporary but severe disruptions to his nervous system, creating symptoms that resembled everything from severe vertigo to cardiac arrhythmia. The medical professionals who had examined him had been unable to identify the cause of his condition, attributing his symptoms to stress, dehydration, or some kind of rare viral infection. But Jake Morrison knew the truth, and that knowledge had fundamentally altered his relationship with power and control. For the first time in his life, he had encountered someone who possessed a form of strength that made his own abilities seem primitive and ineffective. The psychological warfare techniques that had served him so well for years were useless against someone who had been trained in actual warfare, who understood violence on a level that transcended high school social dynamics. The ripple effects of Jake's humiliation extended far beyond his immediate circle of followers. Students who had been victims of his harassment campaigns began to emerge from the shadows, emboldened by the knowledge that the school's most feared bully had been decisively defeated. Sarah Martinez, who had been driven to near suicide by Jake's psychological torture during her junior year, found herself able to walk through the hallways without fear for the first time in months. David Kim, whose academic performance had suffered under the constant stress of Jake's intimidation, began to participate in class discussions again. Lisa Thompson, who had been branded as a troublemaker for trying to report Jake's behavior, discovered that other students were finally willing to corroborate her stories. The teachers and administrators at Riverside High School found themselves dealing with a situation that had no precedent in their experience. The sudden change in the school's social dynamics was so dramatic that it couldn't be ignored, but the official explanations for what had happened were inadequate to explain The transformation that had taken place. Principal Harrison had conducted interviews with Jake Morrison and his crew, but their accounts of the parking lot incident were vague and contradictory, filled with references to feeling sick and dizzy without any clear explanation of what had caused their symptoms. Ethan Cross, meanwhile, had retreated into an even deeper form of invisibility than he had practiced before the confrontation. The demonstration of his capabilities had been necessary to neutralize the threat that Jake Morrison represented, but it had also revealed the existence of knowledge and abilities that were supposed to remain classified. He moved through the school like a ghost, attending classes and completing assignments, but avoiding any situation that might require him to interact with other students or draw attention to himself. The guitar case that Jake had destroyed remained in Ethan's possession, its broken contents serving as a constant reminder of what he had lost and what he had become. The Martin D-28 that his grandfather had passed down to him was beyond repair, its wooden body cracked and splintered by Jake's deliberate act of destruction. But the case itself had become something else, a symbol of the line that had been crossed, the promise that had been broken. The transformation that had taken place in the parking lot that afternoon. The few attempts at communication that other students made toward Ethan were met with polite but distant responses that discouraged further interaction. Amy Patterson, who had tried to befriend him before Jake's harassment campaign had escalated, found herself facing someone who seemed fundamentally different from the quiet, gentle person she had known. His responses to her questions were technically correct, but emotionally vacant, as if he had withdrawn some essential part of himself from the world around him. The psychological impact of what had happened extended beyond the immediate participants to affect the entire school community. Students who had never been directly involved in Jake Morrison's campaigns of intimidation found themselves reevaluating their assumptions about power, strength, and the nature of violence itself. The revelation that someone they had dismissed as weak and vulnerable possessed capabilities that bordered on the supernatural had shattered their understanding of how the world worked. The administration's attempts to investigate the incident were hampered by the classified nature of Ethan's military background and the lack of physical evidence to support the more extraordinary claims being made about what had happened. The medical reports from Jake Morrison's hospitalization were inconclusive, and the security cameras in the parking lot had mysteriously malfunctioned during the crucial time period. Without concrete proof of wrongdoing, the school officials were left to deal with the consequences of an event they couldn't fully understand or explain. The most significant change, however, was in the culture of fear that had dominated Riverside High School for so long. Jake Morrison's reign of terror had ended not through administrative intervention or student rebellion, but through the application of superior force by someone who had been trained to use violence as a precision instrument. The lesson was clear to everyone who witnessed the aftermath. There were forces in the world that made teenage cruelty seem insignificant by comparison, and those forces had been unleashed within their own school. The new equilibrium that emerged from the chaos was fragile and uncertain. Students who had been victims found themselves with unprecedented freedom to express themselves and pursue their interests without fear of retaliation. But they also found themselves in a world where the rules they had understood were no longer reliable, where someone who appeared harmless could possess capabilities that defied comprehension. Ethan Cross had achieved his objective of neutralizing the threat that Jake Morrison represented, but the victory had come at a cost that would follow him for the rest of his life. The promise to his grandfather lay broken along with the guitar in his case, and the knowledge that he had been forced to use his training against fellow students served as a constant reminder of the thin line between protection and destruction. School that had once been dominated by Jake Morrison's psychological warfare was now under the invisible influence of someone who understood actual warfare. And the difference was both profound and irreversible. The final weeks of the school year at Riverside High School unfolded in an atmosphere of uneasy peace. a delicate balance between the old order that had been violently dismantled and the new reality that no one fully understood how to navigate. The hallways that had once echoed with the sounds of Jake Morrison's psychological warfare now carried a different kind of tension, the hushed whispers of students who had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of power, strength, and the nature of violence itself. Ethan Cross had become something of a legend in his own time, a figure whose presence commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. Students would step aside when he walked through the corridors, their movements automatic and deferential, as if they were making way for something dangerous that they couldn't quite comprehend. The broken guitar case that he still carried had become a symbol of transformation, a reminder of the moment when the quiet transfer student had revealed himself to be something far more formidable than anyone had imagined. The academic environment had improved dramatically in the aftermath of Jake Morrison's defeat. Test scores across multiple grade levels showed marked improvement as students who had been living under constant psychological pressure found themselves able to focus on their studies for the first time in years. Participation in extracurricular activities increased as students who had been driven into isolation by Jake's harassment campaigns began to emerge from the shadows and engage with their peers. Mrs. Patterson, the music teacher, had made several attempts to reach out to Ethan about his destroyed guitar, offering to help him find a replacement instrument or connect him with local musicians who might be willing to donate equipment. But Ethan had politely declined all offers of assistance, explaining that he was no longer interested in playing music. The explanation was technically accurate, but emotionally devastating. The connection between music and his grandfather's memory had been severed by Jake Morrison's act of destruction, leaving Ethan with no desire to rebuild what had been lost. The psychological profile that Admiral Reynolds had helped create during Ethan's military training had included extensive preparation for the possibility that he might someday be forced to use his abilities in civilian contexts. The program's instructors had understood that soldiers trained in acoustic warfare would eventually return to civilian life, and they had invested heavily in ensuring that their graduates could cope with the psychological consequences of using their knowledge outside of military operations, but nothing in his training had prepared Ethan for the isolation that came with being the only person in his environment who understood the true nature of what had happened in the parking lot. The other students saw him as either a hero who had liberated them from Jake Morrison's tyranny, or as a dangerous figure who possessed supernatural abilities. The teachers and administrators viewed him with a mixture of suspicion and bewilderment, unsure how to categorize someone who had apparently resolved a major disciplinary problem through means they couldn't identify or understand. The foster family that had taken him in, the Hendersons, had noticed the change in his behavior, but attributed it to normal teenage adjustment issues and the stress of finishing his senior year. They had no way of knowing that their quiet, polite foster son was struggling with the psychological aftermath of breaking a promise to his deceased grandfather and using military training against fellow students. Ethan's ability to compartmentalize his experiences, honed through years of classified operations, allowed him to function normally in their presence while internally processing the weight of what he had done. Jake Morrison's transformation had been even more dramatic than Ethan's, but in the opposite direction. The confident, domineering teenager who had ruled Riverside High School through fear and intimidation had been replaced by someone who seemed to have aged years in the span of a few days. His swagger had disappeared, replaced by a nervous energy that suggested he was constantly looking over his shoulder. His grades, which had been mediocre at best, began to improve as he threw himself into his studies with the desperate intensity of someone trying to distract himself from more troubling thoughts. The few conversations that Jake had with his closest friends revealed the depth of his psychological trauma. He spoke in fragmented sentences about sounds that didn't exist, about feeling like his body was being attacked from the inside, about the terrifying realization that there were forms of power in the world that he had never suspected existed. Tyler and Marcus, who had shared the experience, could corroborate his accounts, but their own psychological state was too fragmented to provide much support or comfort. The medical professionals who had examined Jake Morrison and his crew had been unable to provide satisfactory explanations for their symptoms, leaving them to cope with the aftermath of their encounter with acoustic warfare without any framework for understanding what had happened to them. The official diagnosis of food poisoning or viral infection felt inadequate to explain the depth of their psychological transformation, but it was the only explanation that made sense within the context of civilian medical practice. The broader community of Cedar Falls had begun to notice the change in atmosphere at Riverside High School, but they attributed it to normal fluctuations in teenage behavior rather than the systematic dismantling of an established power structure. Parents reported that their children seemed happier and more engaged with their studies, that incidents of bullying and harassment appeared to be declining, that the school environment felt more positive and supportive than it had in years. Principal Harrison had commissioned a comprehensive review of the school's disciplinary policies and anti-bullying programs, hoping to identify the factors that had contributed to the improvement in school climate. The review team had identified several potential explanations: increased teacher training, better communication between administration and students, more effective intervention strategies, but they had missed the most significant factor entirely. The improvement in school climate had nothing to do with policy changes or administrative initiatives, and everything to do with the fact that the school's most effective intimidator had been neutralized by someone who understood violence on a level that transcended teenage social dynamics. As graduation approached, Ethan found himself facing a future that felt both limitless and constrained. His academic performance had been exceptional despite the psychological pressure he had endured, and he had received acceptance letters from several prestigious universities, along with scholarship offers that would cover his education completely. The settlement from his military discharge had provided him with financial security that most of his peers could only dream of, and his specialized knowledge gave him access to career opportunities in fields ranging from acoustic engineering to defense contracting. But the promise he had made to his grandfather remained broken, and the knowledge that he had used his training against fellow students would follow him wherever he went. The acoustic warfare techniques that had once been tools of national defense had become instruments of personal revenge, and the transformation could never be undone. The gentle, music-loving teenager who had entered Riverside High School with his grandfather's guitar had been replaced by someone who understood the true nature of power and the responsibility that came with possessing it. The final lesson that emerged from the destruction of Jake Morrison's reign of terror was perhaps the most important one of all: that strength comes in many forms, that appearances can be deceiving, and that the quiet person sitting in the back of the classroom might possess capabilities that could reshape the world around them in ways that no one could predict or control. The students of Riverside High School had learned to look beyond surface appearances, to treat others with respect, not out of genuine kindness, but out of the recognition that they never knew what someone might be capable of when pushed beyond their breaking point. Ethan Cross had achieved his objective of surviving his senior year and graduating with his dignity intact, but the victory had come at a cost that would follow him for the rest of his life. The promise to his grandfather lay broken along with the guitar in his case, and the knowledge that he had been forced to use his training against fellow students served as a constant reminder of the thin line between protection and destruction. The quiet transfer student who had once played his grandfather's songs in empty classrooms had become something else entirely, a living reminder that in a world where cruelty was often mistaken for strength, true power belonged to those who understood the difference between the two. 6 months later, Ethan Cross stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall, his fingers moving across the strings of a new guitar, not a replacement for his grandfather's destroyed Martin, but something entirely his own. The audience of 2,000 people sat in absolute silence, transfixed by the haunting melody that seemed to emanate not just from the instrument, but from the very air around them. What they didn't know was that Ethan was using his acoustic warfare, training in reverse, employing the same frequency manipulation techniques that had once been weapons to create something beautiful instead of destructive. Every note was precisely calculated to resonate with the human nervous system in ways that induced calm rather than chaos, healing rather than harm. The music wasn't just heard, it was felt in the bones, in the blood, in the deepest parts of the soul. In the audience, scattered throughout the crowd, were faces from his past. Mrs. Patterson had flown in from Oregon, tears streaming down her face as she watched her former student transform pain into transcendence. Even Jake Morrison was there, having tracked down the concert through social media, his face a mask of wonder and something approaching redemption as he experienced firsthand what Ethan's abilities could create when channeled toward beauty rather than destruction. As the final notes faded into silence, Ethan looked out at the audience and smiled, not the cold, calculating expression that had terrified his tormentors, but something warm and genuine. He had found a way to honor his grandfather's memory while embracing the full scope of his abilities. The promise had been broken, but something new had been built from the pieces. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes. If this story of transformation and hidden strength inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that someone you underestimated possessed incredible hidden talents? Your story could be featured in our next video. Until next time, remember that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about, and sometimes the quietest person in the room has the most powerful voice of all.